Long before European settlers ever arrived in the southern Appalachian Mountains, the indigenous peoples of that region carried warnings about something that walked those ridgelines, something that took the shape of an old woman and preyed specifically on children and travelers foolish enough to journey alone through the deep forest. Most people today only know fragments of that old warning. This is the story of what happened when a small mountain settlement in 1908 encountered something that matched every detail of it, documented far more thoroughly than most stories from that era ever were. Thanks to a schoolteacher who kept a meticulous diary and a county sheriff who took the matter more seriously than most men in his position would have. If stories like this are the reason you're here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story, and I put out a new one every single week. Alright, let's begin. Part 1. The Settlement at Hollow Fork. In the autumn of 1908, a small logging and farming settlement known locally as Hollow Fork sat tucked into a remote valley in the southern Appalachian Range, home to perhaps 60 families spread across a difficult, heavily forested stretch of mountain terrain. The community was isolated even by the standards of that era and that region, connected to the nearest proper town by a single, poorly maintained wagon road that became nearly impassable for weeks at a time during the harsher stretches of winter weather. The most detailed surviving account of what happened in Hollow Fork that autumn comes from the personal diary of a young schoolteacher named Cordelia Ashby, who had taken up a teaching post in the settlement's small one-room schoolhouse only the previous spring. Her diary, remarkably detailed and consistently maintained, survived within her family for generations before eventually being donated to a regional historical society, where I was able to access it after considerable correspondence and, I'll admit, a fair amount of patient persistence. Cordelia's early entries describe an ordinary, if isolated, community life, focused on her students, the challenges of teaching in such a remote setting, and the general rhythms of mountain life as autumn approached. It's in an entry dated late September that the first hint of what was to come appears, almost in passing. A brief mention of local children returning from an afternoon of gathering chestnuts with an unusual, frightened account of an elderly woman they'd encountered deep in the woods, a woman none of them recognized, who had approached them with what the children described as an unsettling, persistent friendliness, asking repeatedly whether they were hungry and offering to show them where the best chestnuts could be found, deeper still in the forest, away from where their parents had given them permission to gather. Part 2. The First Warning Signs. Cordelia's diary describes the children's account spreading quickly through the small settlement, and several of the older residents, upon hearing the description, reacting with a degree of alarm that struck her, at the time, as somewhat disproportionate to what still seemed, on its surface, like nothing more than an unsettling but ultimately harmless encounter with an unfamiliar traveler. It was an elderly resident of the settlement, a woman named Granny Oaks, well into her 80s and generally regarded as the community's most knowledgeable keeper of old mountain lore, who first gave voice to what many of the older residents were apparently already privately fearing. Cordelia's diary records an extended conversation with Granny Oaks, conducted over the following days as the schoolteacher's own curiosity and growing unease drove her to seek out a fuller explanation for the community's reaction. According to Cordelia's careful transcription of that conversation, Granny Oaks described an old warning, passed down through generations of both the earliest white settlers in that region and, before them, through the indigenous communities who had inhabited those mountains for countless generations prior, concerning a being that took the appearance of an elderly woman, kindly and unassuming in manner, who wandered the deep forest specifically seeking out children and isolated travelers. Granny Oaks described this being as possessing an extraordinarily long, sharpened finger concealed beneath her clothing, which she used to strike and kill her victims with a single, precise thrust before consuming their liver, which local legend held to be the source of her own considerable, unnatural longevity and strength. Cordelia's diary records her own initial, polite skepticism at this account, her formal education leading her to privately regard it as a colorful piece of regional folklore rather than any literal, practical warning. But she noted, with evident and growing unease as her entries continued, that Granny Oaks's account matched, in unsettling detail, several specific elements of the children's description that Cordelia herself had not previously shared with the elderly woman, details regarding the stranger's particular manner of speech, her unusual, persistent focus on whether the children were hungry, and a detail regarding her hands, kept curiously concealed within long sleeves throughout the entire encounter, that none of the children had mentioned to anyone beyond their own parents before Cordelia's conversation with Granny Oaks took place. If this story is already unsettling you, and I hope it is, now's a good time to subscribe, because what happened over the following weeks in Hollow Fork grew considerably more disturbing than a single unsettling encounter with a stranger in the woods. Alright, let's continue. Part 3. The pattern emerges. Cordelia's diary describes, over the following 2 weeks, a growing pattern of similar encounters reported throughout the settlement, each involving an elderly woman matching a broadly consistent description, approaching isolated children or occasionally lone adult travelers along the settlement's more remote paths and forest trails, always displaying the same unsettling combination of persistent, almost desperate friendliness and a careful, deliberate effort to lure her targets away from any populated or easily observed area. She recorded an account from a young boy named Elmer Tuttle, who described the woman approaching him while he was alone checking his family's rabbit snares along a forest trail, engaging him in what he described as ordinary, if somewhat strange conversation, before attempting, with increasing insistence, to convince him to accompany her to a location she described only as just a bit further along, an invitation Elmer, according to his own account, declined only because his older brother happened to call out for him from further down the trail at that exact moment, an interruption that caused the woman, according to Elmer's unsettled recollection, to display a brief flash of visible frustration before quickly resuming her previous, careful friendliness and departing into the surrounding forest. Cordelia's diary describes a second account, considerably more disturbing, involving an elderly settlement resident named Amos Kirby, who encountered the woman while traveling alone along a stretch of the main wagon road during the early evening hours. Amos's own account, which Cordelia recorded secondhand through her conversation with his wife, described the woman appearing suddenly at the edge of the road, seemingly from nowhere, engaging him in conversation that grew increasingly, unsettlingly personal, referencing details about his own life and his own deceased family members that he was certain he had never shared with any stranger, details that suggested, with a growing horror he struggled to fully articulate even to his own wife, that whatever he had encountered possessed some manner of knowledge about him that no ordinary traveler could possibly have obtained. Amos, according to Cordelia's account, escaped the encounter only by turning and running the considerable remaining distance back toward the settlement, and he reported, in a detail that Cordelia recorded with particular care given its consistency with several other emerging accounts, briefly glancing back during his flight to see the woman's demeanor shift in an instant, from her previous careful warmth into something he described only as a look no living woman's face should be able to make, before he lost sight of her entirely in the gathering darkness. Part 4. Granny Oaks's fuller account. As the pattern of disturbing encounters continued to grow throughout the settlement, Cordelia recorded a second, considerably more extensive conversation with Granny Oaks, during which the elderly woman provided a far more complete account of the old warnings she had grown up with, drawing on knowledge she said had been passed down to her own family through generations of careful, respectful relationship with several indigenous families who had remained in that region even after the broader displacement of native communities from the area decades earlier. Granny Oaks described the being, according to the oldest versions of the warning she had learned, as an ancient entity that predated any human settlement in those mountains, taking the form of an old woman specifically because that appearance allowed her to approach potential victims, particularly children, without triggering the immediate alarm and defensive caution that a more obviously threatening appearance would provoke. She described the being's true nature as being covered in a form of stone-like skin across most of her body, vulnerable only in a single location, the palm of her hand, a detail that Granny Oaks emphasized with particular care, describing it as the single piece of practical, potentially life-saving knowledge that the old warnings had always considered most essential to preserve and pass down. Granny Oakes described the being's hunting pattern as typically involving a period of careful observation and testing, approaching potential victims repeatedly over a period of days or weeks, gradually building false trust and familiarity, before ultimately striking once a victim had been sufficiently isolated and sufficiently disarmed by her carefully constructed appearance of harmless, grandmotherly kindness. She described the being's motivation, according to the oldest versions of the story she had learned, as being driven by an ancient, insatiable hunger, one that could only be temporarily satisfied through the specific, ritualized manner of killing and consumption that Granny Oakes had described in their earlier conversation. Cordelia's diary records her own growing conviction, by the conclusion of this second, extensive conversation, that the settlement was facing something considerably more serious and considerably more dangerous than any ordinary human threat, a conviction reinforced, in the days that followed, by an escalating series of events that finally forced the wider settlement, and eventually local law enforcement, to take the matter with the seriousness it apparently demanded. If you're still with me, this is genuinely the part of the story where it gets considerably worse, and I do want to say, one more time, subscribe now if you haven't, because what happened next in Hollow Fork is the reason this case eventually drew the attention of the county sheriff's office, whose own surviving records provide the second major documented source for this entire story. Alright, let's continue. Part 5. The First Disappearance. Cordelia's diary records, in an entry dated mid-October, the settlement's first confirmed disappearance, involving a young girl named Bethany Cross, aged 7, who vanished while playing within sight of her family's cabin, disappearing during a brief period when her mother had stepped inside to attend to a younger sibling, a gap in supervision that could not have lasted more than a few minutes based on the mother's own careful, anguished account. Cordelia's diary describes the ensuing search, organized quickly and extensively by the settlement's able-bodied men, covering the surrounding forest for the remainder of that day and continuing, with growing desperation, into the following 2 days, turning up no trace whatsoever of the missing girl beyond a single, disturbing detail discovered by one of the search party members, a small, distinctive hair ribbon that Bethany's mother confirmed had belonged to her daughter, found snagged on a low branch at the edge of a stretch of forest that several search party members reported experiencing an unusual, powerful reluctance to enter any further, a reluctance they struggled to properly explain beyond a shared, instinctive sense that something about that particular stretch of woods was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. Cordelia's diary records the settlement's growing panic and grief in the days following Bethany's disappearance, and she describes, with evident personal distress, her own difficult decision to temporarily suspend classes at the schoolhouse, given the community's unanimous, desperate insistence that no child should be permitted to travel even the short distance between their homes and the schoolhouse without direct adult supervision until the matter had been properly resolved. It was in the immediate aftermath of Bethany's disappearance that the settlement finally sent formal word to the county sheriff's office, requesting assistance that the isolated community, lacking any law enforcement presence of its own, had previously managed without, given the general remoteness and self-sufficiency that characterized life in Hollow Fork. Part 6. The Sheriff's Investigation. County Sheriff Willard Boone arrived in Hollow Fork within a week of receiving the settlement's request, accompanied by a small party of deputized men and his own surviving case notes, preserved considerably more thoroughly than most rural law enforcement records of that era thanks to their eventual donation to the same regional historical society that has preserved several primary sources for other cases I've researched, provide the second major documented account of what the settlement experienced that autumn. Sheriff Boone's initial notes describe a degree of professional skepticism regarding the settlement's account of an unnaturally aggressive elderly woman being responsible for Bethany Cross's disappearance, his own working theory initially favoring either a tragic wilderness accident or, given the era and region's unfortunate, but not uncommon reality, the possibility of a human predator exploiting the community's isolation and superstitious inclinations to disguise a considerably more mundane, if no less horrifying, crime. That skepticism, according to Boone's own notes, began to erode considerably over his first several days conducting interviews throughout the settlement, as he gathered independent, broadly consistent accounts from numerous residents, including several, like Amos Kirby, whom Boone's notes describe as displaying no evident motive or inclination toward exaggeration or fabrication, describing encounters with a woman matching a remarkably consistent physical description, engaging in behavior that Boone, despite his professional inclination toward rational, grounded explanation, found himself increasingly unable to satisfactorily account for through any conventional understanding of ordinary human criminal behavior. Boone's notes describe a turning point in his own private assessment of the case occurring during his examination of the location where Bethany's ribbon had been discovered, a stretch of forest that he personally visited, along with several members of his deputized search party, in which he described, in his own careful, professionally restrained notes, as producing an immediate, powerful, and entirely involuntary sense of unease among every member of his party, an experience he noted as sufficiently unusual and sufficiently consistent across multiple experienced, professionally composed men that he found himself unable to simply dismiss it as collective superstition or suggestion. Part 7. The Second Disappearance and Boone's Encounter. Cordelia's diary and Sheriff Boone's own case notes both describe a second disappearance occurring roughly 10 days into Boone's investigation, involving a young boy named Franklin Pruitt, aged 9, who vanished under circumstances remarkably similar to Bethany's disappearance, briefly unsupervised near his family's property before vanishing entirely, with no trace beyond a single item of clothing discovered at the edge of the same general stretch of forest that had proven so unsettling to Boone's search party weeks earlier. It was in the immediate, desperate search that followed Franklin's disappearance that Sheriff Boone himself, according to his own detailed account, experienced a direct encounter that fundamentally and permanently altered his understanding of the case he was investigating. Boone's notes describe separating briefly from the main body of his search party, moving through a particularly dense stretch of forest in pursuit of what he believed, at the time, was a genuine, physical trail worth investigating independently. He described encountering an elderly woman, matching the description provided by numerous settlement residents in exact and unsettling detail, standing motionless at the edge of a small clearing, watching him with an expression that Boone's own notes describe as displaying a warmth and friendliness that struck him, even before she spoke a single word, as fundamentally deeply wrong in a manner he struggled to properly articulate even in his own professional case file. Boone described the woman engaging him in brief, unsettling conversation, her manner and speech matching, in remarkable detail, the pattern of behavior described by numerous previous witnesses throughout the settlement, and he described his own growing, instinctive alarm as she gradually, carefully attempted to draw him further from the main search party and deeper into the surrounding forest, using a combination of grandmotherly concern and increasingly specific, unsettling references to details about his own life that he was certain, with growing horror, he had never shared with any stranger throughout his entire career. Boone's notes record his decision to draw his sidearm, at which point the woman's demeanor, according to his own careful account, shifted with startling, instantaneous speed into something he described only briefly and with evident, lasting difficulty, referencing an expression and bearing that no living woman's face and posture should have been physically capable of producing, before she retreated, with unnatural speed, into the surrounding dense forest, moving in a manner that Boone's own notes describe as bearing no resemblance whatsoever to the careful, elderly gait she had displayed only moments earlier during their brief conversation. If this story is getting to you the way I hope it is, subscribe now, because I need to tell you what Sheriff Boone did next, drawing directly on Granny Oakes's old warning, and about the fate that ultimately befell the two missing children, which remains one of the most genuinely unresolved and haunting conclusions I have ever brought to this channel. Alright, let's finish this. Part 8. Boone's Plan. Following his own direct encounter, Sheriff Boone's notes describe seeking out Granny Oakes personally, setting aside his earlier professional skepticism entirely in favor of drawing directly on her extensive knowledge of the old warnings surrounding the being the settlement had come to believe was responsible for the two disappearances. Boone's notes record an extensive conversation with Granny Oakes, during which she reiterated and expanded upon the details she had previously shared with Cordelia Ashby, placing particular emphasis on the being's singular vulnerability, the exposed palm of its hand, as the only practical means by which the entity might actually be confronted and stopped. Boone's notes describe organizing an expanded search party over the following days, drawing on considerably more of the settlement's able-bodied men than his initial investigation had involved, and adopting, at Granny Oaks's careful, detailed instruction, several practical precautions drawn from the old warnings, including a deliberate effort to travel only in larger, more heavily armed groups, and a specific instruction to any party member who might encounter the being directly to attempt, above all else, to force a direct confrontation targeting her exposed palm rather than attempting to flee. Given Granny Oaks's insistence that the being's speed and cunning made successful flight considerably less reliable than a direct, if dangerous, confrontation. Boone's notes describe an extensive, difficult search of the deeper forest surrounding the settlement, continuing over the following week, eventually leading the party to a location considerably further into the mountains than any previous search effort had ventured, a stretch of dense, old-growth forest where several party members reported experiencing the same powerful, instinctive unease that had characterized Boone's own earlier visit to the site of Bethany's ribbon discovery, though considerably more intense and considerably more difficult for the men to push through despite their numbers and their determination. Part 9. What the search party found. Boone's case notes describe the search party eventually locating a small, hidden clearing deep within that unsettling stretch of forest, containing evidence that Boone documented with the same careful, professional restraint he had maintained throughout his case file, though his private notes, considerably less restrained than his official report, describe a discovery that provided grim, definitive confirmation of the two children's fate, evidence that Boone's own notes describe processing with considerable personal difficulty, despite his by that point extensive law enforcement experience with the ordinary, if still terrible, realities of violent crime. Boone's notes describe the search party's brief, harrowing direct encounter with the being itself at that clearing, a confrontation that his own account describes in fragmented, understandably difficult detail, given both the chaos of the actual encounter and his own evident, lasting personal distress in recording it even for his private files. What his notes do confirm clearly is that the confrontation, following Granny Oaks's careful instruction, ultimately succeeded in driving the being from that location, through a combination of the search party's numbers, their armed determination, and at least one direct strike against the being's exposed palm, delivered by a member of the search party whom Boone's notes identify only briefly, seemingly out of a desire to protect that individual's privacy regarding an experience Boone clearly understood would follow him for the remainder of his life. Boone's notes record the being fleeing the clearing following that confrontation, disappearing deeper into the surrounding mountains with a speed and manner that several search party members described as bearing no resemblance whatsoever to any ordinary human or animal movement they had ever previously witnessed, and Boone's own case file, in its final surviving entries, records no further confirmed encounters or disappearances attributable to the being for the remainder of his time investigating the case, though he noted, in a final, striking marginal comment, his own private and lasting uncertainty regarding whether the settlement's confrontation had genuinely eliminated the threat entirely, or simply, temporarily, driven it to seek easier, less defended territory elsewhere in the vast surrounding mountain range. Cordelia Ashby's diary, in its final entries covering that autumn, describes a settlement forever changed by the events of 1908, a community that resumed its ordinary rhythms of mountain life only gradually, and only with a permanently altered, considerably more cautious relationship with the surrounding forest that had, for generations before that autumn, simply been an unremarkable, everyday part of settlement life. She recorded Granny Oaks's old warnings being passed down with considerably renewed seriousness to the settlement's younger generation, no longer regarded as simple, colorful folklore, but as genuine, practical knowledge that every child in Hollow Fork was carefully, deliberately taught from that point forward. I want to close by noting that the specific being described throughout this story, an elderly woman with a single deadly vulnerability in the palm of her hand, corresponds closely to warnings and stories that exist, in various related forms, across multiple indigenous communities throughout the broader Appalachian region, predating any European settlement in those mountains by countless generations. I believe the remarkable consistency between those much older, independently documented traditions and the specific, detailed account preserved in both Cordelia Ashby's diary and Sheriff Boone's own professional case notes lends this particular story a weight and credibility that I don't think I can responsibly dismiss as simple coincidental regional superstition, however much easier that explanation might ultimately be to accept. If you ever find yourself traveling alone through genuinely remote wilderness, particularly in older, more isolated mountain regions, and you encounter an elderly stranger who seems unusually, persistently interested in your well-being, unusually eager to lead you further from any populated area, I want you to remember Hollow Fork's story and Granny Oaks' old warning, and to trust whatever instinctive unease that encounter might provoke considerably more than any surface impression of harmless, grandmotherly kindness. That's the story of what Appalachian settlers in Hollow Fork encountered in the autumn of 1908, told as completely and as faithfully as Cordelia Ashby's diary and Sheriff Willard Boone's own case notes allow, and it remains, to this day, one of the most extensively documented yet genuinely unresolved encounters I have ever brought to this channel. If this one kept you up, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I put out a new story just like this one every single week, and I would genuinely hate for you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you'd grown up hearing any version of this old warning yourself, and tell me whether you think the being Hollow Fork encountered was ever truly driven away for good, or whether it simply moved on to find easier, less defended territory somewhere else in those same ancient mountains. Thank you for listening. And if you're ever deep in unfamiliar mountain forest, and an elderly stranger approaches you with unusual warmth, asking, again and again, whether you're hungry, I hope you remember this story, and I hope you keep your eyes, above all else, on her hands.